And welcome back to Speech 101 with me, Matt Hribar. And I'm really excited to jump in today because it's history. And a little preface, history is not my formal background, but I do love history. And it is important to kind of see how speech has evolved over the thousands of years that people have been speaking. Now, we talk about the idea of storytelling an audience. That kind of goes all the way to the discovery of fire, even, right? Thousands, tens of thousands, 40,000 plus years ago. We've been telling stories, we've been speaking to each other, obviously for the most part of our species. But in terms of how public speaking came about, well, the answer is really simple right off the bat. It is ancient Greece. That is what a lot of people attest to the birth of the art of speaking. Well, of course, a lot of speaking in ancient Greece was designed around persuading people. So persuasion, we also have a lot to credit kind of persuasive techniques to ancient Greece as well. We see things like democracy, right? The idea that everyone has a voice, everyone has a say in something. No matter what you think, you kind of had that ability to stand up and say that. And of course, more eloquent speakers, the better. You can say something, the more that people may have listened to you, may have believed you, may have persuaded you. And that's kind of how we have a lot of these infamous philosophers of the day, is just because they were excellent speakers. Not only did they have great logical skills, but they were able to articulate that logic really well. We see the birth of juries. This idea that, you're going to have two opposing arguments. You're going to have someone saying, I didn't do a crime, someone saying, I did, and then someone arguing that you did do that crime. I almost said that someone's arguing that they did do the crime, but I don't think that really happens in a lot of jury rooms. And so that also too is persuasive, right? Convincing people that I'm innocent or guilty. And this is also the birth of speeches of praise, the ability to, speak to each other. And we still do this, right? I mean, especially if you go to like any kind of fancy gala, I'd like to thank so and so. I'd like to thank so and so's contribution for the gala, yada yada. So speeches of praise, all three of these things, right, are really essential, actually, speaking experiences that we see all the time. Whether or not we're at juries or galas all the time, maybe that's a little bit too much. But indeed, the concept that we are persuading one another is that's inherent. So the nature of rhetorical, it was actually a really central role in the Greek education, and it was an Olympic event. And frankly, if it was still an Olympic event, I might qualify. I feel pretty confident that I would qualify for that. And that's how important this really was in ancient Greece. It wasn't just the idea that, here in college, right, you probably get frustrated with, oh, speech is mandatory. Well, guess what? In ancient Greece, you'd be taking a lot more than just one speech class. And we get dialectics. And dialectics kind of comes down to, well, it's conflict resolution. It's a philosophical method of inquiry. You are settling opposing positions. Both sides of an argument can be explored. And it provides a means for addressing unjust arguments, right? And so it's kind of a big game of gotcha, right? So you might say something and then your opponent goes, well, you said X, and the reason X is wrong is because, if X is right, then that means Y is right, and we know Y is wrong, right? But the beautiful thing about this was it was very accessible to the masses. It was very accessible to most people who were living in ancient Greece. Think about speaking today, right? Most of us, we have an ability to speak. And of course, the more that we train ourselves to speak, we get better, not only in terms of how we're speaking, the tone, the inflection, which we'll get to. That's going to be a future episode. But how we present the material too. We get clearer and crisper on that as well. Now, there were two styles of Greek oratory. You have the sophists, and these were traveling lecturers who really believed there was really no such thing as universal truth. No universal truth. This philosophical relativism. It really emphasized entertainment. Which goes to show you, people are like, oh, all these people today design, they want to be entertained. No, humans, we've always wanted an ability to be entertained, right? That's very innate in our nature. Sophists use a very ornate style. It's kind of done up big, and that goes along with entertainment, right? When you go to a theater show, right, we love when it's done up big, right? And sophists were very easy to follow. Right? You want it to be accessible. The average reading grade age is about fifth grade, sixth grade. So it goes to show you that if you're trying to reach the majority of people, right, if that's your average, you want a speech that, might even be appealing all the way down to maybe third, fourth grade, and so you want, depending, but that also depends on the venue, but We'll get there. We'll get there. Now, the second style, the Attic orators, these specialized in areas, law, science, really emphasizing logic and reasoning. It was very difficult to follow. So people, it was very easy to lose people. But right, the emphasis was on logic. And so maybe with sophists, right, you have no universal truth, so you can kind of get away with saying anything, or, making those arguments that, well, that could be true or it could be untrue. And if that's untrue, it could be true, which, is kind of entertaining to play with, right? You're at a bonfire and someone's like, what if, there is alien life forms, but then maybe there's not. Of course, we speak like that a lot. But with Attic orators, the idea was, right, like I said earlier with X and Y, if X is true, then we know that Y is true because, X equals Y, etc. Now, the question, of course, with the Yosto styles, what's the better style? Am I gonna am I gonna have a really strong emphasis on entertainment? Is it going to be accessible? Is it going to be difficult but really emphasize logic? Well, the answer is both. Modern orators should be both, right? The content should be based on strong reasoning and support, right? Ethically, you should have logic. Ethically, right? It should be truthful, sourced data. Okay. It should make sense. You want it to make sense logically, correct? And of course, you want it to be approachable. The style, the delivery, you want to engage the audience. You want people to get to pay attention to you. If you can't do that, then it doesn't matter what you have to say, no one's listening. So the reasoning needs to be sound, right? But also accessible. And we see this a lot too, like academia, right? We want to throw all these terms, a lot of jargon, legalese, and that's hard for people to follow. So you have to be willing to kind of compromise and of course maybe explain things depending on what your topic is. Don't assume, that you're in a room and everyone knows what a difficult or a complex word is or, a scientific word, a Latin term, right? You want to be careful with those kind of things as well. Now, the Roman Republic, they adopted rhetoric, but really emphasized the legal training. So there was a need for a strong foundation across fields. And so that was in all departments, all kind of subjects. And rhetoric was considered the highest form of intellectual activity, which I think the ability to talk well is still considered to be an intellectual activity. I don't know if it would be considered the highest form today, but rhetoric, once again, is the essential part of education. And there was also thought that rhetoric should follow natural language and thought order. Now, of course, we kind of see the differences between, the different, the philosophical agents of the time. So Aristotle, the faculty of discovering in any particular case all of the available means of persuasion. Plato, the art of enchanting the soul. That's what he thought rhetoric was. Versus Quintilian in Roman times said the art of a good man speaking well. So see how that's very different, those two. Those two are very opposed. And Cicero in Rome says, well, one great art is comprised of five lesser arts: the invention, the discovery of arguments, disposition, the arrangement of arguments, allocution, oh my gosh, my Italian, you guys, arrangement of arguments, memoria, which is your memorization, oof, difficult for me, and your pronunciation, which here he's referring to your delivery, how you deliver it. So see how Aristotle was, well, no, this is just all the available means of persuasion. That's what rhetoric is. But here in Roman times, no. It is a discovery of arguments, the arrangement of said arguments, the expression of your speech, how you deliver it, and if it's memorized, right? So very different way to approach rhetoric. Although I think if you were to say, that if you were to give Aristotle that quote from Cicero, I think he would say, well, those are some legitimate claims. We get to the Middle Ages, and unfortunately for many things, the Middle Ages, we see a steep drop off. I mean, that's just truthful. That's just the truth, no matter, what discipline you are, right? The Middle Ages, unfortunately, is when kind of academia, thought, expression, the concept of pushing the envelope, all these things just kind of fall to pieces. So speaking becomes preaching, educating, writing letters. That's really that's really all. And of course, writing letters, how many people in the Middle Ages could actually read, let alone write a letter, who had access to writing a letter? St. Augustine says that the duty of every Christian is to explain the Bible. So, in a way, right, the emphasis on speaking then was persuade people to believe, right? I mean, if you look at the Crusades, was that not kind of this sense of duty to not only just explain, but to convert or to also, murder those who do not believe, and so we'd have to persuade people to go and risk their lives in order to fight for their religion. So a lot of the speaking that we see here is just tied up into faith, into Christianity, especially. And of course, the Renaissance now, when we look at this, this is now focused on the power of language through humanism, that the human world is constructed through language. There's also now, we see the burgeoning of the rationalism movement. We're looking for objective, enduring scientific truths, right? And so that's kind of similar to the logic that was being used in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, right? Now, I will say this is all very Western, and of course, my background is not necessarily in the history of speech. It's just being a pretty good speaker. But I'm sure if we looked at kind of Eastern cultures, we looked at African cultures, we looked at Indigenous American cultures, I'm sure that there's also elements that they were taking on in terms of their speech, speaking skills, public speaking. Now we move past to our modern. What do we've kind of, where have we fallen? Well, we have epistemology, emphasis on the psychology of rhetoric, a higher burden of proof, right? A couple hundred years ago, you could probably burn someone at the stake for being a witch. These days, right, it would be kind of, I don't think I've ever seen a modern witch trial here in America, although there's probably other countries where maybe it's still happening. But the burden of proof is higher than ever before. Fingers crossed. Of course, unless you have people who unfortunately throw that away for some sake. There's also a need to understand human nature, and this kind of reminds me of plot lines and stories, where a lot of the original stories that we've seen, right, in olden times, it was this idea of man in the wild, man versus, power, this human power. You see man versus himself, man versus God. And now we're kind of building up to um, depths of potential and depths of self as well. You have an aesthetics or the Belles Lettres movement, and this is really the emphasis on the beauty of rhetoric. And this is very telling, because there's been a lot of pockets since the Industrial Revolution of time periods where the goal, no matter what it was, right? Art Deco, architecture, art. It was oh, we wanted to look beautiful, we wanted to look pretty, darling. And so this time period in the last 150 years really has broadened the scope of rhetoric, really brought the fine arts into it. And I would argue too that entertainment's always been a little bit of key in some elements of public speaking, but now there's even a stronger demand for the entertainment of public speaking. This is a quote about the Belles Lettres movement. Literature that is an end in itself and is not practical or purely informational. So we're just enjoying. It does not need to be practical. It does not need to be purely informational. The fact that the literature itself is the end game, very different from what Aristotle or Cicero would say. I think both of them would say, "Well, no. What are you trying to argue? What's the point? Why are you speaking if you don't actually have a point to make?" Right? And of course, we now have a stronger delivery emphasis. So the elocutionary movement. So now more than ever, how do you deliver that speech? So that's a little bit of history for you. I think it's really fun to kind of think about the context of where public speaking's come and gone from. And when we pick up next time, we're going to talk about introducing and closing out your speeches. So until then, we'll see you soon.